Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the New Jersey HIMSS Security, Privacy, and Compliance Task Force webinar. Our webinar today is Breach Management, Stories from the Trenches, the purpose of which is for our panelists to really talk about their experiences in the breach management space and with their organizational collaboration around breach management. Today we have three panelists who will be joining us. First is Judy Gash. Judy Gash is the Director of HIM and HIE, as well as a Privacy Officer at Central State Healthcare System in Freehold, New Jersey. Also joining us is Hussein Syed, Director of Security at Barnabas Health. And joining us also is Vikrant Arora, Director of Security at Health and Hospitals Corporation of New York City. Our program today will last about 45 minutes. Our panelists will each have a portion of the program where they'll talk about their own stories and hopefully share some learnings with our membership. Subsequent to the session, the panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A period. Please, if you could use the chat window to enter your questions, we'd be more than happy to take as many of them as we can when the allotted time period. The session will last approximately 45 minutes. And with that, we'll start with our first panelist, Judy Gash. Judy, tell us your story from the trenches.
Good afternoon. I thought it would be interesting to go and look to see what's going on right now as far as, how many breaches are out there, what's the OCR doing, and I just found two brief paragraphs from two different resources. First, I was surprised to find out the OCR actually has this wall of shame for breaches that are involving 500 or more individuals. So in 2013, there was 160 large data breaches reported involving more than 6.8 million people. When I looked further about that 160, I found that the top 5 breaches actually accounted for over 88% of the individuals affected. And 3 out of those 5 involved stolen equipment and unencrypted electronic files with PHI. Some of the things they discussed about those lessons learned about the top 5 was that some companies are only encrypting their mobile devices, and one of these breaches actually involved someone stealing a desktop computer. So the big thing there is encrypt everything. Also, monitor where your information is going. It's going to be a lot easier if you do inadvertently send information to the wrong party. Just being able to know where it went so you can quickly resolve the issue is a big plus up front. Also, a lot of facilities will hire a destruction company and to do their shredding, but nobody bothers to follow up, make sure they're following their policies and procedures. So it's really important to at least once a year go out, see what your vendor's doing and making sure that they are following your policies and your contracts. So then I looked up to find out what's going to be happening in 2014, and the OCR had done this audit pilot program back in 2012, and they are now doing a permanent audit program in 2014, and they've actually taken the audit and made it more narrow in scope so that they could do a significantly higher number of organizations, and they're going to be auditing a lot more than the 115 they did in 2012. So I just found that interesting and thought it would be a good way to kind of ease into the different experiences we've had. At Central State, we've had 2 experiences with the OCR, both being individual breaches reported to them from a patient. The first one was as simple as the patient went to pick up a copy of their medical records from the radiology department. The person who copied the records accidentally included one patient long page and it wasn't even the patient whose information that was breached reporting it, it was the person who received the wrong information. So that, although it was deemed as not being a breach, it was not defined as a breach, I can tell you it took me 9 months to resolve the issue from when we were notified by the OCR until when we actually got the letter that we were cleared. It involved at least 10 formal responses, them calling me all the time asking me for additional information, additional documentation, fax it to me, you know, can you scan it and email it to me, we need it quickly. Yet their responses back to me still took these, you know, 9 long months. So it's very, very time consuming. The other experience I had was somebody claiming that somebody inappropriately accessed our electronic medical record from an external vendor. And we did find out through audit trails that there was no breach. So luckily for us, you know, both came out favorable for us. One thing I was surprised at the end of each of those, well, at the end of the first one I discussed about the patient getting the wrong information, I had to update our accounting of disclosures to show that that person received, or that person's documentation was sent to somebody other than somebody they either consented to or was for payment treatment or healthcare operations. So that I found very interesting for that request. The other thing is just to remember for September 2013, those changes, the new thought process is it's a breach until it's proven not a breach, almost like you're guilty until you're proven not guilty. Before, the thought process was it's not a breach until it is. So you're always under the radar, under the microscope as far as any breaches going forward. And I think the patients are really aware now of what they should and could be doing to protect their own health information. So with that, I will turn it over to Hussein.
Hi, good afternoon. First of all, I could thank HIMSS and Blueprint for hosting the webinar. So I'd like to dive into the breach management portion of the discussion. We like to call it planning for the breach because it's inevitable that a breach will take place. Sooner or later, it's not if, it's when the breach takes place. So we all need to be prepared to be able to deal with the breach. And it starts with planning. You got to have your policies in place, both for incident management and breach management, because not every incident will turn into a breach. Breach is only when there is unauthorized exposure of PHI or PII. That's when breach really is defined as. Whereas anything that happens in your environment, theft of an encrypted device or misuse of credentials or anything where there is no unauthorized disclosure of PHI, is simply an incident and needs to be dealt accordingly. So you start with making sure you have your policies for both incident and breach management. You have a methodology in place to identify an incident which morphs into a breach, and then you will be able to contain that situation so that there is no further harm being done while you investigate to remediate and contain that situation. And then finally you have to make sure that you follow up with some sort of lessons learned so that such a thing never happens again. So talking about breach strictly here, I'll talk about an incident which is a little dated in our environment, was around removable media. Since then, or for some time, we've been encrypting our removable media, laptops, and a whole bunch of other stuff, but just the purposes of this discussion, I'd like to talk about this because it kind of gives you some sort of an insight into what goes on when a breach takes place. So we had a thumb drive misplaced in a conference room, and since we couldn't find it, we had to term it as a breach and go with the risk assessment of making sure how it took place and what would have happened and what type of data was on the removable media, we had to plan to notify the patients whose information was potentially exposed, since we didn't know what happened to the thumb drive. And it's a pretty lengthy process to just plan if you have not prepared to handle a breach. First of all, identifying the information that could have been on that removable media. You have to validate the accuracy of the data. You have to make sure that the information that you have about the victims, in this case, is accurate, so you can notify to them at the right place. You have to prepare the letter that needs to go out. It has to be properly, crafted to make sure that you're balancing the need of urgency for them to make sure that they do something about it, or also not get extra, paranoid about that their identity is at risk. So you kind of have to balance both of those. Aside from that, you have, depending on the size of the breach, you have to do your OCR notification if it's 500 or more within the 60 days, or really at a time when you notify the patient, you have to notify OCR as well. You have also to make sure that if you have 10 or more patients whose addresses you do not have on file or cannot validate correct addresses, then you have to do some sort of public notification as well. Additionally, if there's any social security numbers or any financial information involved, then you have to make sure that you provide some sort of credit monitoring. So as you can see, all these numbers start to add up, the expenses start to add up, and the average benchmark is about $50 to $200 per record in a breach, and you can easily extrapolate depending on the number of records you have at risk. So you get, depending on the size of the breach, I said you need to kind of prepare to what you are going to do. You may have to set up a call center. You have to make sure that during your preparation or planning for the breach, you go out and do some marketplace analysis and make sure that you can find a call center that can support breach management, and that includes mailing of the letters, dealing with the return mail, a call center that's prepared to answer the questions for the people who are calling in, and if they're not satisfied, to escalate it to somebody in the privacy group who can actually put them at rest and provide them whatever information they need to know. So that's one piece. Second piece that goes with is to make sure all the documentation, starting from the risk assessment, any type of communication that you've had, any type of internal discussions that have been conducted, are all documented in a chronological order, so that when you go forward to report the matter to OCR, you have all the documentation to provide them in case they have any follow-up questions. And as Judy mentioned, it is a task of its own to deal with post-breach investigation from Health and Human Services. The other piece that you really need to make sure is that once you identify a breach, you want to make sure that whatever caused the breach is immediately remediated or addressed, and you take appropriate action to make sure that that's done, so that when you go into the post-breach management, you're able to certify that you did what caused the breach initially, among other things. So the most important piece is to make sure that you're prepared to deal with the breach, or prepared to provide proper documentation, risk assessment, follow-up documentation, and then you do the breach notification to the affected individuals and be prepared to deal with it in a very professional manner. And with that, I'll pass it over to Vikram on post-breach management.
All right, thanks, Susan. Thank you, Vikas, for the opportunity to arrange this webinar. I think it's a great topic. Before I get into our story, I just want to let everybody know what HHC is. So New York City Health and Hospitals is the largest municipal healthcare organization in the States. We are a network of 11 acute care hospitals, 4 nursing homes, and 6 diagnostic and treatment centers with over 70 community-based clinics. We see approximately 1 million patients. Almost half of them are uninsured, so we are a non-profit organization. Personally, my name is Vic Arora. I'm the Director of Security for the corporation, and today I'll be talking about a data breach incident that happened back in 2010. The data on electronic media was lost while it was being transported from one location to another by one of our business associates. It took us about a little over 40 days to come up with the official release, and which is still within the regulatory requirement of 60 days. The breach involved over 1 million patient and healthcare records being compromised, or at least stolen. There was no instance of them being compromised. We just lost the medium, and we had to go through the breach notification. Specifically for the response, the first thing we had to do was notify multiple civil, local, and federal authorities, including but not limited to the New York Police Department, the New York State Attorney General's Office, New York Office of Computer Security, the New York State Consumer Protection Board, obviously HHS, and we also engaged 3 nationwide consumer reporting agencies. Also, as part of the response, in order to notify all the affected individuals, we had to print letters in 17 or so different languages to be mailed out using first-class mail to all the affected individuals. And in addition to the response from a notification standpoint, we also provided I think 1 year of credit monitoring and fraud resolution services to all the affected individuals who wanted to take us up on the service. And besides the letters, HHS or HHC also set up a hotline. There was a telephone number that was available, publicized, so that affected individuals could call in and get information about the breach, or if and what type of information was lost. Since it involved a business associate, it was a little bit more tricky than a breach without a business associate. We still have a case going on, so I'm not at liberty to disclose much information. But as part of our response, the contract with the vendor was terminated, and that's pretty much all that I can say at this point. Some of the biggest hurdles that we had in responding to the breach, I mean, there's a lot of data out there, template from HHS, and a lot of security companies also that outlines everything that needs to be done, but the actual implementation of certain activities become extremely difficult depending on the situation you are in. So in our case, the biggest hurdle was identifying what type of information was existed on those removable media devices. So that took us the biggest time, and I was really going back, looking at all our archives, processes, and coming up with every possible combination of data that could have been on those media. And because as part of the notification process, we're also required by HHS to disclose that what type of information was compromised. Was it social security? Was it medical history? Was it just addresses and phone numbers? So you have to really know what type of information existed. And the other hurdle was obviously dealing with the business associate agreement. Again, there was a lot of back and forth, but the bottom line is that no matter who's involved, at the end of the day, if data is lost, it's your responsibility. You're the one who will be held accountable by all agencies. I mean, even if a business associate agreement is there and a contractor is involved, they can help out with the damages, there can be legal implications and what have you. But from a government and a state standpoint, it's always the company that lost the data or had the breach. Those were the 2 main hurdles that we had in reporting. Some of the recommendations that I have for everybody from our experiences, I know you guys are going to hate me for this, is information classification. It's extremely important for you to know what type of information exists on what kind of devices, because with especially with cloud computing and bring your own devices and all these things, information is going to be everywhere. So unless you have a very clear understanding of where your sensitive information exists, it becomes all the more likely that we'll be meeting the breach requirements every time a device is lost if we don't have a clear understanding if the device has information on it or not. I mean, it was a rare incident what happened to our organization, but I believe that it's a lot more easier with these smartphones and other devices to lose these devices with information, and if, again, we don't know what type of information exists, it becomes very difficult. And the other piece is, again, if you're, I mean, I'm sure all of you have a lot of business associates, we went back personally and tried to look at some of the contracts that needed to be updated. So it's extremely important that the language is clear and it's well understood as to who is responsible for what type of actions, what type of risk is being assumed and accepted by both parties. And one of the things we've started doing is that we try to, whenever we engage a new vendor, we try to explicitly ask them that have they ever suffered a breach in the past few years, and if yes, what was their response? Those kind of questions basically give you the maturity the vendor has in terms of a breach response, and then you can compare it against your own standards and see there might be a delay from the vendor side in responding to a breach, and you can see if that delay is less than or more than what you are required to by the letter of the law. And then another thing we're trying to do is asking the vendors for an annual security assessment of their environment. I see a lot of conversations with these, especially with the cloud vendors, that we should ask to perform risk assessment on them, just like we do risk assessment on our network, because they're part of our network and they have the same data as ours. The response we got from one of the leading cloud vendors was that if they allowed all their customers to do risk assessments on them, that's pretty much all they'll be in the business of doing, because they have hundreds of customers, and if everybody wants to do a risk assessment once a year on them, they pretty much would not have any bandwidth to do their core functionality or core business. So what we found satisfactory was that if the vendor performs a risk assessment, which is the level of scope and the thoroughness of that assessment is in line with what we have in place, that can be considered acceptable. But again, it's not a legal advice by any means. It's just something that we need to look at. Other than these two specific things, it's always good to have your incident review process frequently checked, having tabletop exercises, getting everybody in the room and just having a random case of somebody losing a removable media and see what actions need to be taken. That'll give you a good idea of how ready you are or not. And given looking at the OCR's wall of shame that Judy was talking about, you can get a good idea of what are some of the commonly reported cases. And it's not a whole lot of bandwidth to conduct tabletop exercise where you just find out whether the documentation exists, whether you know if you lost a certain type of media, what kind of information exists or not on those devices or not. And I would also recommend having an outside counsel as well as forensics firm on a retainer of some sort, so that when something like this actually happens, we're not struggling to find a good business partner who understands our business, who's familiar with our business workflows, and is also familiar with the regulatory requirements we have. And those things are already taken care of ahead of time. And the last thing I wanted to briefly touch upon was the OCR compliance review. I was actually part of one of the review processes from OCR as well. And one takeaway, if anything, from this webinar, at least from my perspective, that all of you should have is a risk assessment plan. No matter what the breach is, you will be asked to provide specifics around that breach. Let's say you lost a laptop. They would want to know, show us documentation if the laptop was encrypted, show us your policies around laptops and all that. In addition, they would pretty much all the time ask you that where's your risk assessment plan. That's pretty much one of the primary documents that shows due diligence on your part, that you conducted a risk assessment, you know where information is, and what are the risks that the corporation is ready to take. So that's pretty much a standard request from OCR, at least from my experience, in addition to whatever else they ask depending on the incident. With that being said, I'll hand it back to Vikas.
Thank you, Vikrant. So I did want to mention, I forgot to mention, introduce myself before, so I'm Vikas Khosla. I'm the President and CEO of Blueprint Healthcare IT. I also want to thank Jamie Reynolds, who is one of our executive directors who helped put this program together. So now we'll move into the Q&A portion of our presentation. Thank you all very, very much for what you shared. We're getting some great questions and comments on the chat line. Though we did ask the panelists before we started the session that if they had questions for each other, that they should certainly let us know and foster some dialogue. So Judy actually had a question, so we'll start with Judy and then we'll go to the questions that came through the chat line.
So when I had talked about the 2012 pilot program that OCR conducted, they actually found that two out of three of the facilities had no or inaccurate risk assessment performed. So we all know prevention is easier to manage than to fix a defect. So I'm going to ask my colleagues, what was your experience doing your own risk assessment, and do you think that a lot of what you found really mitigated the potential of a breach?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for Barnabas Health. Every time we do a risk assessment, we find new things. Because it's always an evolving process. Applications get upgraded, new systems get added, business practices change, and as you know, healthcare is such a dynamic environment. There's hardly ever a time to kind of take a step back and do things because you're moving at a very rapid pace. So my recommendation would be to at least have an annual risk assessment program in place, both for your key applications, business processes, so that you can sort of mesh them together and see how information flows. Because there are, like Vikram said, there are a lot of avenues of data leak that we have not even uncovered. Mobile devices, online storage, public email. These are all areas where you have to gauge the risk and benefit before you allow anybody access to any of them. We tend to be on the conservative side and give limited access to these areas, especially online storage, web mail, so that people don't even inadvertently leak data. But the ongoing risk assessment is pretty critical in this space.
Yeah, I would agree with what Hussain is saying, that, and to answer your question specifically, that it helps tremendously from a breach prevention standpoint, because for the most part, the problem we as security professionals face is making a business case in front of our management for that. So having a risk assessment done by an outside agency or even an internal agency with significant separation of duty, you can easily make a case to the management that, hey, we're asking for money, or we're asking for budget, or we're asking for certain support because it poses a business risk. Like, being in a hospital environment, it's very well understood that there's risk from infected needles, there's risk from catheters, and all those things. And when there are those risks, the OCR and NJHIMSS have fundings and etc. associated with those, and those funding support is fairly easy. With security, we have a little bit of an uphill battle where we need to make a business case. So from making a business case standpoint and from proving due diligence, if you ever have to get into a court, I think risk assessment is the key piece. So.
And one item I would like to add is transparency. If you can make it transparent that the senior management is fully made aware, not the Fed factor, just the realistic expectations of what will happen if something were to go wrong, goes the wrong way, because executives are generally looking at the risk from a different lens than we do, and they can make a better decision. They're apprised of the risks.
Actually, there's a question that we have that wasn't on the top of the list, but it really goes to this question as a follow-up, so I'll ask it first. How do you quantify, or how have you quantified the impact of a breach, and do you respond differently based on that impact assessment? Judy, you want to comment on that?
Well, since mine were
really to everyone.
Yeah, since mine were only individual breaches, obviously under 500 individuals, I didn't have to produce all those letters and do all, those responses to the people who had their PHI breached. But I do have a question off of that. If you sent out 500 letters, because I know sending out one letter is enough, but sending out 500, did you get feedback from patients saying, oh my God, my information was breached, what are you doing about it? You know, if you send out 500, I'm assuming you're getting a lot of feedback from patients that, you know, are dissatisfied, and like, how did you respond to that?
Well, so we had to set up a call center. You have to have that prepared. In your preparation phase, you make sure that you have an agreement with the entity that can staff the call center and with the appropriate answers to the questions. So you provide them with an FAQ, because it's inevitable some people will call to find out what happened, what really happened, because they won't take the letter at its face value. They would like to speak to somebody to get some answers. So you kind of have to first, the circumstances around the breach, what the organization did to prevent it from happening again, and what have they done to secure the patient's information. And if they have any other questions, follow up with the privacy officer from there on. So those had to be done. Typically, you get about 4 to 5% people call in a breach situation. And it all depends on how the letter's crafted, and make sure that it hits all the important points that will satisfy them that their information is secure. And it is not. It's different for for a target breach versus a healthcare breach, because in a target breach, it's guaranteed that this information was stolen. Where here, there was an expectation that there may have been some exposure because we lost the device. And most people who steal a laptop currently are only stealing it for the value of the laptop, not the data on it. So there's a little difference in how financial sector breaches are versus healthcare breaches. But we have to make sure that we satisfy the patient or the affected individual that their information is secure in our systems.
Do you have a comment on it?
Yeah, if I can just chime in on, I do agree that there's a significant difference in the financial and the healthcare data breaches, but at the same time, what makes it more grave is that if you lose medical information, you pretty much would have no idea until in what capacity that information is misused. That makes it all the more scary. If a credit card is lost, it happened to me, somebody just used my Macy's credit card to buy a mattress, and I knew about it, and I was able to adjust with it, and the credit card is, after that's scrapped, number's gone, and I'm done with it, I'm moving on. Even if worst case scenario, I can even change my social security and move on if it's an identity theft. But if somebody has access to your medical information, there's pretty much nothing you can do about it. Your allergies, your infections, your everything, reactions to a medication, that becomes all the more grave, and it's harder to prove a point, but the value of a healthcare record, I think, will soon surpass whatever is associated with the credit cards. But just wanted to throw that in.
So in general, would you say that, with the breach that happened in your organization, did it elevate the level of awareness at the executive and at the board level around this issue, and that you got more support and potentially even more funding for your programs?
Absolutely. I would again, every time there is an incident, and it's true not just for our organization, in general for our country. I mean, after 9/11, the business continuity and disaster recovery industry grew 10, 20 folds. After the shooting at the theaters, AMC proposed gun scanners and all that. So in my opinion, security is like a theater. I mean, when there's an incident, immediately everybody understands the risks because you've seen it happen. Until that, you're just hypothesizing that, oh, this might happen. So yeah, definitely it helps.
So there's a question that came in for you, Vikram, specifically. The question was, can you describe briefly your organizational structure for managing the breach management process, and do you own that, or is it under compliance?
So it's under compliance. There's a separate organization outside of my organization. So I'm part of the security department, primarily responsible for engineering operations, security architecture, performing forensics and vulnerability analysis. And then we have the compliance office that is responsible for security, HIPAA privacy, and HIPAA security issues. So they were the ones primarily driving this because it's a healthcare breach.
Great. Hussein, question for you. Are you implementing or requiring your business associates to either adopt a framework or develop their own framework for managing security in general in the breach management process?
So as part of our third-party assessment, we have adopted a questionnaire that we kind of changed from the BIDS, shared information group. But we do not force or require a framework, but we do expect a policy set to be there, a risk assessment to have been performed, breach management policies to be in place. If we're dealing with some sort of software development, we make sure that the software has been properly developed, risk assessed, and also the DR, BCP items have been addressed. We do ask for a SOC report, type 1 or type 2, and if they have it, we take it. We're leaning towards asking bigger providers to have a SOC report done, but I don't know how well it is adopted. We haven't found HITRUST to be adopted fairly well in the healthcare industry. We're hoping it gets, because I think that it actually hits the mark for healthcare security, but we haven't found many providers who have actually gone that route.
Got it. Great. Judy, question for you, given your HIE involvement. How involved are you? Well, you're very involved with HIE, but how involved or integrated is the privacy and security process within your HIE initiatives and within your breach response plan?
Well, obviously, once information goes beyond the walls of your facility, it's a little scary. At least for me, it was. But we really did our due diligence to see how exactly our vendor or our HIE platform was secure, how we could do random audits for breaking the glass. We're about to open up our patient portal now. We just decided, and I really pushed for this, that we have an individual person authentication process in place, so we did hire a vendor to do that for us, because I just felt it was too easy for somebody to go in and say, this is my birthday, this is my name, sure, go ahead, here's your information. So we really went through a lot of pain getting that put in place, because I really had to get management and the executives to understand how important it was. So, yeah, you really have to be on top of things to make sure that, any vendor you use or any time your information goes beyond your walls, that, you are monitoring at all times.
Great. A follow-up to that, and this is for whoever wants to answer this. Will ACO and population health programs increase risk, in your opinion, and what will you do from a compliance standpoint? And are you preparing for more enforcement as patients have more direct access to data? Anybody want to take that one on? Even if you're sort of projecting into the future, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely increases the risk from a basic fundamental perspective. The attack surface is going to increase. So your information is now, previously it was within a company's, like Judy's saying, 4 walls, and now all of a sudden with health information exchanges and the National Health Information Networks, it's going to be all over the internet. Of course, behind certain encryption and controls, but again, it's more information available, the attack surface is more, and naturally the risk would increase. And what was the second piece to
patients having more access to data.
Yeah, so in order to facilitate collaboration, when you're making information available, you're making it available to a larger pool of people, which includes both good and bad.
So do you see within your organization a response to that, or requests for your department to sort of enhance your programs, thinking about the patient and patient engagement?
Yeah, and I think with the whole, with the Obamacare and the high tech, that kind of helps because it associated funding with the Meaningful Use 1 and 2 compliance. Some of the things within Meaningful Use 1 and 2 do again refer to the risk assessment piece, and there's funding available for it. So I think that helps. The business case is already made, the funding's already there, so all we have to do is just implement. I hope there is more regulation like that. I know, again, some people would hate me for that, but it's a lot easier to get funding that way than trying to make business case on our own.
Judy, do you have any thoughts on that topic? I know you're very involved in things that are healthcare transformation related at Center State.
Well, although, encrypting and securing PHI, I think a lot of the older population is still a little scared of it. But I think that it's a really good thing. It's going to help patients monitor their own care and be able to get more involved in it. I wish that when my parents were ill, I had the ability to pull up their information and keep it, you know, in an organized fashion where, you know, before everything was paper, everything was all over the place. So I think it's going to be great for patients, and they're going to learn that there's more benefit to it than the risk involved.
So from your perspective, do you think that the risk for patients will be somewhat mitigated by their desire to have this information?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think we have about 1,000 patients who walk into my department a month asking for a copy of either the lab, the emergency room, just because they want to see it.
So having it electronically
right.
will benefit them from that perspective, and potentially
Absolutely.
they're willing to safe harbor you to some degree because we know the risk profile will increase by also just getting that data out there. So that's what I'm reading.
I don't necessarily agree with that, but you know, if you have...
Good to have a counterpoint.
If there, as a covered entity, you're always accountable for patient data security. Even if it's business associate, and if your ACO is a business associate or you have a homegrown one, you still have to do a thorough risk assessment to make sure where are the weaknesses. And luckily there are some good models out there now where you can actually secure an online portal, like you went out and you know, retained a third party to do validation of identity so that your environment is protected. So there's better models out there now that we can leverage to protect the ACOs and HIEs and also patient portals. I think that's where we probably would have to focus on how to make sure we not only identify the person trying to log into the portal and additionally do some authorization to make sure it's the right person attempting to log in. I think that's where the breaches may have, from the medical identity theft perspective, people may try to, especially if it's a seniors population, they would try to steal their insurance information or something to utilize it for, and like Vikram said, I think the value of patient information is a lot higher than financial information now. You could sell it for a lot more money, so there will be a lot more people looking to steal it.
Jifa?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what I probably said was so previously the gold was, again, within the company and nobody had access to it. Now you're going to have that gold available online. So that, from my perspective, is just a very scary thought. So and again, I do also agree that the benefit significantly outweighs the risk, but just a risk that you kind of will have to accept.
So, you know, as industry experts here, just as we get to we're actually a little bit over our time, but we'll go over one last question, which is, from the breach management process perspective, you know, the topic of this webinar, do you feel that your organizations, one, and then the industry as a whole, is keeping up with the federal requirements? Do you think you're behind and you're trying to catch up? And what do you see in terms of the future in it really being able to handle this issue effectively? What is it going to take within your organizations to handle it effectively? So I'll just kind of go around the horn, and maybe I'll start with you, Singh.
So from the breach management perspective, you have to be prepared for a breach. It's not an IT function to deal with a breach notification. I think IT's function is simply, or security's function is to identify, perform the thorough risk assessment, apprise the privacy and legal, and also internal audit of the circumstances and what is at risk, so that they can make a better determination of what the next steps have to be. Your public relations within an organization have to be prepared for it. So we, at Barnabas, we do have a sort of a workbook for breach management, which includes every aspect of the business, and it just sort of a workflow moves on to their area, and they review it, and then if they have to go outside and engage in the office to do what they need to do, and it's done. But you have to be, ultimately it becomes a well-oiled machine because you've done it a couple of times. You kind of know how which route to go.
Judy, can you talk a little bit about the industry perspective? How do you think we're doing as an industry?
I'm going to go back to the HIE, only because this is something that really is rattling my brain, that, you know, we're moving at such a fast pace, information is moving so quickly, but I don't see any real standards around the HIE, the health information exchanges, that are saying, even policy-wise within our state, that, you know, it's okay to send this kind of information. Sensitive information, you know, should be held back. It shouldn't be held back. If I'm going to have a statewide HIE, you know, everybody's going to send this information. There's going to be standards, and, you know, a national one is something that I see is farther away than we kind of think.
So you, from your perspective, we're still sort of playing catch up to what's actually happening with this.
Yeah, I'm ready to go,
data.
and, you know, I'm reluctant to move any faster than, you know, we are, because there's nothing there. There's nothing, no solid regulations to really protect me.
I'm going to ask you the question a slightly different way, which is, if you think about all of the entities that are involved in the breach management process, from the providers to the physician, the hospitals to the physician, patients, business associates, what do you think is right now the area where we need to improve the most? What's the weakest link, if you had to, you know, project?
Business associates. I think that by far I would agree, because over a period of time, we've done a lot of work within my company to do a lot of things just like my peers would have. Regulations help us, but again, when you're dealing with business associate, not until recently they were covered by the same regulations as healthcare industry. Just now they've started to they have to comply with HIPAA and other things. Before that, they didn't have to. So even if you look at that, HIPAA has been around like since 1996 or something, and even the healthcare is still kind of not struggling but trying to keep up with it. So now all these hundreds and thousands of business associate and partners we've had, all of them have to comply with it. So if we couldn't do it in like 15, 20 years, I guess it'll take them quite a while to get there.
So they have a strong financial incentive to get there. Are you finding that your organization is more selective because of the security posture, security program at a business associate as to who they work with?
I don't know, because I don't know how other healthcare, like to that level of detail, I don't know how granular they are. Like Judy was saying, there's no standard as such. I can say, okay, we're adhering to these standards and another hospital is adhering to these standards. It's just a best effort for now. Like PCI and some other regulations, they're very prescriptive. HIPAA is not as prescriptive, and we have to rely on NIST. And then the answers, even if we ask our legal and other people for cloud and smartphones, it's not clear answers that are available. So it's just like a best effort right now. I hope it changes with regulations, like Judy was saying.
And I think with the business associates, from an IT security perspective, you can only do a risk assessment and then provide that risk memo to the business owner and let them make that decision whether it's worth engaging a vendor that is not fully complying at a minimum with the HIPAA technical administrative controls. And if they make that decision to move forward, then they're accepting the risk. And if they come back and ask for assistance to provide some recommendation of how the vendor could become, or associate can become HIPAA compliant, then that's a different conversation.
Well, great. Well, we've gone over our allotted time. I want to thank all of you for participating today. It's greatly appreciated by NJHIMSS, by our membership. I think this is valuable information. We knew from our surveys from last year this is the kind of topic that our membership was very interested in learning more about. I wish you all no more further breach management issues. I hope the best for you in that regard. And again, I thank you for your participation. And thank you to all the attendees for listening in on the session. We hope that you got a lot of value from the discussion for today, and certainly from these esteemed panelists that were here. So once again, the New Jersey HIMSS Security, Privacy, and Compliance Task Force thanks you, and we look forward to having our next webinar, which will be in late March. We'll be sending out information about that. And for those that will be at HIMSS 14, we look forward to seeing you there as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.